Welcome to our Chapter Zero In Conversation event with Lord Turner, Adair Turner, and Emily Farnworth. But before I say more about them, let me say just a bit about Chapter Zero. Many of our participants will know Chapter Zero well, but for those of you who don't, our mission is to help non-executive directors ensure their companies are truly focused on what it takes to achieve global net zero and that aspirations and goals are translated into robust plans and clear, measurable action. We now have 1,400 plus members who we engage through workshops, toolkits, and other resources, along with important opportunities to share experiences and connect with peers who face the same issues. Our library of resources grows all the time and enables members to actively progress climate discussions in their own boardrooms. I know that the two boards I chair have benefited from what Chapter Zero has to offer. So, if you're not a Chapter Zero member, and you are a non-executive director or chair of a business in the UK, I'd very much encourage you to sign up and benefit from our resources and our growing peer community. Now, back to today's conversation. We are immensely fortunate to be joined by Adair Turner. Adair is a truly extraordinary figure, combining intellectual rigor with energy and passion for addressing some of the toughest issues of our age. His focus on tackling the impact of power generation and delivery in relation to climate change has led him to chairing the Energy Transitions Commission. He also advises Envision Energy, a wind turbine and energy management software concern, and he was also the first chairman of the UK's Climate Change Committee and speaks around the world on climate-related issues. But Adair has had extraordinary impact in the world of financial services as well, having served as chair of the Financial Services Authority and playing leading roles in the redesign of global banking regulation after the financial crisis. He's also helped steer British business as a former Director General of the CBI, but has also supported working people as the chairman of the UK Low Pay Unit and the chair of the Pensions Commission. Within business, Adair was a senior partner of McKinsey, where we first met, I think, about 35 years ago, and was also vice chairman of Merrill Lynch Europe, and has had a number of other non-executive roles, including his current chairmanship of Chubb Insurance Europe. And there, I missed the opportunity to work with Adair, having stepped down from Chubb about a year before he arrived. Adair also continues various guest academic roles and writes regularly for Project Syndicate, which is sometimes referred to as the world's smartest op-ed page, and has published a number of important works on the challenges in finance, including the books Between Debt and the Devil and Economics After the Crisis. But let me now turn to our interviewer for today's session, Emily Farnworth, who is co-director of the Centre for Climate Change Engagement at Hughes Hall University of Cambridge, where she joined us from the Environmental Resources Management Consultancy, a major environmental consultancy, which I also know well because I was also previously an NED there, and where she was previously Global Director for Low Carbon Economy Transition. Emily has played a number of key climate change roles, including as the head of climate initiatives for the World Economic Forum, where she set up the Climate Governance Initiative, the Alliance of CEO Climate Leaders, the Mission Possible platform, and the Natural Climate Solutions Alliance. She continues to chair the advisory committee of RE100, which is an initiative driving demand for renewable power. All of that adds up to about 25 years of experience working with businesses, government, and nonprofit organizations to help them move towards a low-carbon economy through research, campaigns, and communications, all in support of creating true systemic change in how business manages its carbon future. So this is, as you will have gathered, a pretty informed conversation, and one I know from which we will all take away important insights. So without further ado, let me hand you over to Adair and Emily. Right, off you go.
So I'm going to dive into the structure for today's session. We're going to have around 35 minutes for me to pose a number of different questions to Adair to kind of really explore what's going on with energy transition, and in particular recognizing that this is very much directed at kind of what boards are needing to do, to what kind of conversations they need to have, what do they need, what questions they need to be asking of their executive teams in this transition. We're then going to open it up to a couple of questions, and we'll close promptly in around 55 minutes. So maybe just as an opening question, Lord Turner, and just to sort of set the scene, I guess, what would you say are the priority areas for the energy transition that we're needing to really focus on right now?
Well, thank you, Emily. It's a great pleasure to be joining this meeting. At the absolute core of the transition to a zero carbon economy is to electrify as much of the economy as possible and to make all of that electricity zero carbon. And so in the documents that the Energy Transitions Commission, which I chair, has set out, we have talked about taking electricity from being 20% of final energy demand today to as much as 60 or 65% by 2050. And that requires electrifying most of residential heat. It requires electrifying road transport. It requires using electricity even more intensively across parts of the world. A big growth of electricity will come from the spread of air conditioning as people in hotter climates get to middle-class standards. Overall, we will see a massive growth of electricity. It will replace many uses of fossil fuels, and it all needs to be zero carbon. And I want to stress that because that is sort of 2/3 to 3/4 of what we've got to do. But then there are some sectors of the economy, and it was my own Energy Transition Commission, which really 3 years ago labeled these the harder to abate electricity, we can decarbonize the world. We cannot at the moment technologically electrify long distance cement production, chemicals production. So we have these hard to abate or hard to electrify sectors, and we need a clear vision of how to electrify those as well. Now, it turns out that when you look at those sectors, you actually come back a bit to electricity because you realize that one of the ways to decarbonize those sectors is to use hydrogen. You can turn hydrogen into ammonia, and you can burn it in ship engines, and you make the hydrogen primarily from electrolysis using green electricity. So in addition to the, say, 60 or 65% of our energy, which might in future come in the direct form of electricity, there's another 10 or 15% which will come in the form of hydrogen. So electricity plus hydrogen. But then you've got the sort of last 20% or so, and you need a role for bioenergy there, though you need to make sure that you limit that to truly sustainable bioenergy, because it's very easy for the development of bioenergy to compete with food production or to be at the expense of biodiversity. And there is a role, but a much diminished role, for fossil fuels combined with carbon capture and storage. So I would think about, we think about at the core of the energy transition, electrification, most important, hydrogen, very important, a role for bioenergy, and a role for fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. Put them all together, and we can get to a zero carbon economy by 2050, even in those hard to abate sectors of the economy, where you can't simply say, let's electrify them, as you can for road transport, at least for light duty road transport.
No, it's really interesting, and it's really interesting to hear it broken down that way. And we'll obviously make sure that a number of the reports that the Energy Transition Commission has worked on are available to everybody. I just want to reflect, we obviously saw the net zero report coming out from the International Energy Agency yesterday. How do their kind of numbers, if you like, stack up with what you're seeing as well?
Well, as you might expect, Emily, we've been doing a crash read looking at this very interesting report from the IEA, which I have to say is a huge step forward in the contribution of the IEA to this debate. And Fatih Birol, the executive director, and all of his team should be congratulated on a really great report. Directionally, it's exactly in line with the Energy Transition Commission. It doesn't go quite as far On electrification, they're talking about electricity going from 20% of final energy demand to about 50%. We think as much as 60 or 65. Very similar in terms of hydrogen. Indeed, we're trying to understand, they think the hydrogen element of it can grow faster than we think in the 2020s. A bit more bioenergy than we have in our scenarios, but same order of magnitude and much less than people used to think 2 or 3 years ago, as we all realize the dangers of trying to extract too much biomass from the natural environment. And really interesting from the IEA, for the first time putting together scenarios of quite dramatic reductions in fossil fuel use, with only a limited use of fossil fuel use plus carbon capture and storage. So directionally, it is very, very similar. And what the IEA have done in their report, essentially they've said, this is what needs to happen to get to a net zero economy. And this is what needs to happen for the transition from now to 2050 to be compatible with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. The other thing they've said, however, is with forceful enough policies, it is absolutely doable. And once we've done it, it will be at no or very trivial net cost to the global economy. So it's an optimistic point of view. It's very much in line with our thinking, with some interesting variants, but they are variations at the margin, I would say, between IEA thinking and ETC thinking, rather than anything fundamental.
And you've done an incredible job there of kind of simplifying kind of this sort of, you know, that vision of transition and where we're headed. Obviously, there's lots of different decisions that businesses need to make to navigate this, not least, as you point out, the need for policy to help drive this transition. What would you say are the kind of critical things that boards need to really get their heads around, and the sort of questions they should be asking in the context of what this latest information is showing to us?
Look, the crucial first thing for a board is to make sure that it truly understands the emissions for which that company is directly or indirectly responsible, both the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, which is the actual, you know, gas that you're buying and consuming in a gas boiler. It's the electricity that you're buying, which might indirectly have carbon emissions. That together is scope 1 and scope 2. And then scope 3, of course, is what are people doing to your products? How are they using them? Does that produce emissions? And up your supply chain, is somebody producing emissions? The crucial thing is to understand that and to get that absolutely clear. And of course, what that then defines is that the challenges are very different for different companies. If you are a financial services company or a law firm or some other form of professional service firm, essentially your emissions are going to come from primarily 2 things, well, maybe 3. There may be heating and fossil fuel-based heating of your offices. There'll be a big use of electricity, and there'll be some transport costs because of aviation. And so you need a clear plan of how you are going to get those to net zero, either directly by, for instance, switching your gas boilers over to electric heating with heat pumps at some stage, or by cutting down on aviation emissions, or by helping other people do it. I mean, a financial services company can't decarbonize all of its electricity supply, but it can commit to buying zero carbon electricity. So you have companies like that, where there isn't all that much to do within the body of their own actual operations. Go to the other extreme, and if you're the director of a cement company, the big emissions that are being produced are in those cement kilns that you are running. And then you've got to say, well, okay, what are the technologies which can take us from now to 2050 and be zero carbon? And you will find that they are about decarbonizing the heat input, perhaps using biomass, perhaps using hydrogen, perhaps in future using direct electrification, and also applying carbon capture and storage. So once you get beyond the generic statements, it varies hugely by company to company. But the absolute first step is make sure you know what the scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions are, and then work out what is the strategy that you need either directly to reduce your emissions if you are directly producing or not, or to demand that your suppliers or help your consumers reduce their emissions in the inputs or the use of your product.
No, and you make a really important point then in terms of even if a lot of your emissions are coming from somewhere else in the system, you need to then kind of really think about how you engage with that kind of supplier, if you like. I guess in the context of electricity, there has been quite a lot of effort for decarbonising, if you like, electricity systems around the world. In the context of perhaps where you've got a construction company, looking to buy cement, or an automotive company looking to buy steel, again, what kind of pressure should they be putting on for these harder to abate sectors to change as well?
Well, that is a very good point. And let's take steel. Within our ETC, we are now very much engaged in discussions with the steel industry and with the automotive industry as how we can create demand for green steel. Now, in a sense, you talked earlier, Emily, about what is the balance between independent private initiative and public initiative. As long as you have a carbon price that applies across the board, green steel, even if it's more expensive to produce, will have the same price as dirty old-fashioned steel because it will face a carbon price. And at one level, if you had a completely pervasive carbon price, you would say, okay, that's okay for the automotive company to simply buy the cheapest steel because it will be green steel. But actually, there is a big role for automotive companies to get ahead of the curve and say, we would like to buy green steel, and we are willing to pay a premium price for the steel producers who are putting in place the pilot and the early demonstration projects. Because remember, let's take steel. We know how to produce steel in a zero carbon fashion. We can either add carbon capture and storage, or we can use hydrogen as the direct reduction agent rather than a coking coal, but it will be more expensive. In the world saying, we could within the next 10 years produce green steel, but it will be more expensive. Is somebody willing to buy it? Now, the reason why an automotive company ought to be willing to buy it is that it actually makes a trivial difference to the end product price. If the steel that goes into a car is 25% more expensive because it's been made in a green fashion, that's only going to add about 1% to the cost of the car. So if by taking a 1% extra cost, you're able to turn around to your customers and say, this is a car made with green steel, then that may well work as a consumer proposition. But the other one you mentioned, I think, is really important. And I do want to stress this because we often don't focus enough on the construction sector, the property sector. Cement, which then goes into concrete, is a very, very a carbon intensive material. Again, we know ways to get it to zero carbon, but they will add appreciably to the cost of cement and still materially to the cost of concrete. So what we do need, we need property developers and we need the public sector to be willing to say, I am going to specify that there must be green cement and green concrete in my supply, even if that is going to add, and it probably will add, 2-3% maybe to the cost of the building. Now, of course, that gets difficult if you are competing with other people that don't do that. But if you're actually a property developer and you've got the land, you know you're the only person who's going to do that development, you don't have to develop it at the cheapest possible price. Down the supply chain, of course, a cement company, which is producing cement in a zero carbon fashion, it needs to be paid more for that, otherwise it's going to be out of business. So this whole issue of the supply chain in property development, public procurement, construction, hugely important area to help the cement companies go down the zero carbon route.
And you talked a lot about, the fact that all of these sectors do have opportunities available to them. And we've heard a lot in the press around all these new net zero by 2050 goals, and we know that's the end game, but there's also been some criticism about whether or not actually we should be more focused on the short-term goals, given the importance of the sort of emissions cut that we need to make in the next sort of decade, or less than a decade now. What's your sense of sort of almost, are there priority areas that companies need to be thinking about in terms of, okay, if we're going to invest in this or push on this thing will get us the biggest impact in the short term, knowing that obviously everything is important in the longer term?
This is a huge focus now, for instance, within what's called the COP26 team, the UK government team, preparing the conference in Glasgow this year. I think all of us have realized that over the last year, we've had this accumulation, very welcome, of commitments, both by countries, by cities, by regions, by companies, to get to net zero by 2050. And about 70% of global emissions are now covered by institutions or political entities that have made that commitment. That's very good news. But if you were to add up all the country commitments currently being made within what's called the NDC, the Nationally Determined Contribution process within COP26, what you'll find is, let's take CO2 emissions from the energy, building and industrial and transport sector. If they're sort of 33 now, they might get to 0 by 2050, but they'll still be 28 in 2030. All the predictions are that they come down, but they come down, as you were, on a convex curve. If you then go off to the scientists and talk to the scientists about what we need to do to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade, they describe a concave curve in which you get emissions down from 33 now to 20 by 2030, and then a lower rate of reduction thereafter. And so there is a disconnect, not now in where people think we can get to at the end of the period, but how fast we can get there. Now, some of this is inevitable. I mean, let's take a challenge in road transport. We are now seeing, and I would like to see more, of countries, companies, individuals saying we are going to ban the purchase of internal combustion engines beyond 2030, or all our new fleet purchases are going to be EVs, etc. But here's the challenge. If from 2030, all new sales of vehicles are electric, it takes till 2045 before all the stock on the road is electric. Across all of the economy, we have these stock flow effects. Take shipping. We don't yet have ammonia burning ships. If from 2025, every new ship is ammonia burning, it will still take us 25 years to get to a serious proportion of the existing fleet, which is at. And this is what almost mathematically drives one to saying, look, the natural reduction is a convex curve. But what you're absolutely right, Emily, having realized that, you've then got to say, well, what can we possibly do to accelerate that in the first 10 years? How do we get that convex curve closer to a concave curve in the next 10 years? And so there's a lot of focus now on what are the easier wins. One is to get completely rid of methane leaks and methane emissions. If you are on the board of an oil and gas company, or a company which is using a lot of gas, crucial thing to realize is that methane is an incredibly powerful greenhouse gas. So if that is leaking out of the system, it is having a disproportionate impact. And actually there are ways to do that, and we really need tight regulations and very strong commitments from every company which has the possibility of methane leaks to crunch them down. We also need to power as fast as possible the elimination of coal from the global power system. Now, that is going to happen in the rich developed world. In any case, I would be very surprised if beyond 2030 there are any coal-fired power stations working in Europe or in the US, given the Biden plans. But there's a lot of them around the world, and they're still being built. So an absolute commitment from anybody in a financial services company, we will never finance another coal-fired power station. That again is one of these early leverage effects. It's quite interesting. We've just been comparing the IEA forecast that you mentioned earlier, Emily, with our own forecasts for what might happen to emissions. And we've realized that they actually have a faster pace of emissions in the 2020s. It's entirely explained by the power sector, and it's basically explained by believing that we can persuade the developing world to exit coal faster than we've put in our scenarios. So methane leakage, getting rid of coal, accelerating as fast as possible the electrification of transport fleets. So any board which buys either vans or trucks or cars of any sort, the sooner that one gets a commitment to electrification or using hydrogen in those fleets, the faster it pulls forward the point at which the new flow is zero carbon, and that then brings forward the date at which the stock is zero carbon.
No, it's really fascinating and extremely helpful to get those very specific sort of priority areas that we can just kind of get on with immediately. You mentioned this interesting idea that, for the finance sector, pulling out of coal investment is, number one on the top of the list. But by the same token, what's the role of the finance sector in financing this, in all the different kind of guises that are available to the financial system to support this transition? What would you say to that sector?
Well, the finance sector, of course, is several things. It's the asset managers, it's the banks. And when it thinks about what it's got to do, I think it needs to think through both what positively has to happen and what negatively mustn't happen. So on the positive point, it's very important to realize that of all the investments required to build a zero carbon economy, something like 70 or 80% of them are fundamentally about building a much, much bigger green electricity system. It's about more wind turbines in the North Sea, more solar in Spain. It's about distribution company investments, transmission company investments. Quite interesting when you do the figures and step back, people talk about the investments required to build a zero carbon, but think about 75, 80% of that in that electricity sector. So that means that for the sort of companies, asset managers, pension funds, insurance companies that want long-term investments at a moderate rate of return, i.e. towards the lower end of the risk return spectrum, right? Because they're not technologically speculative, they don't depend on consumer behavior. There is going to be huge opportunity. The world is going to be full of infrastructure investment opportunities to invest at rates of return which will not be shoot the light out rates of return, and they shouldn't be because we want this stuff free, but will be better than buying index-linked government bonds at negative real interest rates. So huge opportunity there for that part of the finance sector, which is into long-term, lower risk, lower return, patient infrastructure commitment. That's going to expand. At the other end, there's red lines. Do not finance coal. Do not finance any high cost new oil or gas developments. Those are going to be stranded assets and we simply don't need them. And I would say pretty close to let's really start crunching down on new exploration and production of oil and gas generally. And that is what the IEA is doing as well. It's a bit of a grayer area there, but that's the big area of debate. And then there is the issue of what do you do with the harder to abate sectors? What you've got to do is have a real engagement with the steel company or the shipping company that you are financing as a bank and say, show me your path to net zero because I, as a lender to you, want a path to net zero. One of a good step forward on this is the major ship finance banks in the world have produced something called the Poseidon Principles, working along with what's called the Global Maritime Forum, which are a set of principles which define how they will do ship finance to make sure that they are supporting this transition, both in terms of the ships, but also in terms of the port fuel handling facilities, which will help drive us towards zero carbon shipping. Final thought on finance: if you are a big mortgage bank, remember that one of the biggest and most complicated challenges in the UK is how do we decarbonize residential heating? Probably on average, 20 million households are going to have to spend, let's say at some stage, 10 or 15,000 pounds to insulate their houses better and to replace existing gas boilers with heat pumps. Not always the case, but that will probably be the predominant case. Think about 10 to 15,000 pounds. Now, if a mortgage bank can come up with a very simple product that says, if your loan to value at the current position is only 60%, I stand ready to lend you that extra 10 to 15% very smoothly, very straightforwardly, adding it on to your low cost mortgage rate of interest, rather than you having to go off and take a bigger loan elsewhere, then that could be a big contribution. So that area, and it takes me back actually, Emmy, to that point earlier, I don't think we often talk enough about the property business, the property construction business, the mortgage bank business as being an important part of what both that relevant industry, but also the financiers to that industry have to do.
Yeah, and I just think that point about the sort of the financial system needing to really kind of engage with some of these sectors to sort of jointly look at what that transition plan looks like, so that the kind of expertise, if you like, from the finance sector can feed into some of the investment plans where you've got some quite difficult decisions to make, I would guess, in terms of choosing between a carbon capture and storage investment versus switching to hydrogen. I mean, those things are not easy decisions to make, I guess, for some of these organizations. Look, I think we're going to take a couple of questions. I know that there's a lot of questions that have come through, and so I know that we're not going to get to everybody. We will make sure that we keep a note so that we can get back after the session and answer as many questions as we possibly can. But maybe if I can just, Robert Jennings, if I can just turn to you, maybe you could, put forward your question.
Sure. Well, thank you, Lord Turner. That's very, very interesting. I was particularly interested in your guidance to directors of service companies on what we should do now to help the energy transition. But it did occur to me that for some time to come, it will be impossible to completely eliminate emissions from our business models, particularly, for instance, aviation-related travel may be significantly reduced, but it's not going to disappear altogether. And I wondered if you had any guidance that you wanted to go a bit further with and say, what should we do to mitigate those unavoidable, in the short to medium term anyway, emissions? I mean, should we be, as companies, be supporting offsetting? And what would be the best way of doing that? Or should we be supporting the development of green kerosene, for instance, and a commitment to buy kerosene at future dates, green kerosene at future dates at above the market price?
Yeah. Okay, so the service sector in general, of course, is sort of 80% of our economy and means many different things. It means retailers, it means financial services, it means IT companies, it means aviation companies, and of course aviation is then bought by people. But let me focus specifically on that issue of aviation, the aviation sector itself, and buyers of aviation, which are in terms of business class dominated by the sort of professional services end of the economy. Aviation, the routes to decarbonisation will probably be as follows. there's probably about 25% of emissions, which by 2035 or thereabouts, or maybe a bit later, we will be able to get rid of through electrification and hydrogen. We are heading towards electrified short distance planes, originally just sort of commuter hopping planes. But people like Airbus are thinking that by 2035, they could get as far as 100-seater planes going 1,000 kilometers in an electric route. There is also hydrogen and hybrids. So there is going to be a electrification and hydrogen route for part of aviation, but it will only gradually develop over time. You know, it'll take time before those planes are available, and then they'll have what I referred to earlier, the stock flow effect. It'll take time to get it come in. For a jumbo jet across the Atlantic, it's not reasonable to assume that we will electrify that in the next 30 years, if ever. At current battery densities, in order to get a jumbo jet across the Atlantic, you'd need about a 200-ton battery, which would be doubling the price of the jumbo jet without the battery. That is just not credible. In order to electrify long distance flight, somebody clever in the labs has got to come up with a way to make batteries which are about 8 times as much energy dense per weight. Possible it may occur, but there's no way we should bank on it. So the way forward with aviation is almost certainly either using biofuels, which might be what you meant by green kerosene, producing the precise chemical equivalent of conventional jet fuel from biosources, or synthetic, what's called power to liquid sources, whereby you use hydrogen made from electrolysis, you take CO2 out of the atmosphere with direct air capture, and you synthesize those together. Both of those routes are absolutely technologically possible. They have some time limits and they also a higher cost, but they will take time to develop. But by 2050, we could have zero carbon aviation from the variety of those technologies. So what should a responsible professional service firm today do? One, it should cut out unnecessary travel. Having learned over the last year that video conference does work, it should really crunch down on the crazy journeys that I used to make of flying off to China and having one day of meeting and come back again. There will be a role for flying to the other end of the world once a year for the 2-week time with the other factory, with the other members, whatever it is, but less frequent, but maybe longer visits, I think is part of the responsible approach of financial service firms, professional service firms, the legal firms, the consulting firms, everybody who is a big user of a business aviation. The other thing is stand ready to pay a higher price to support the development of these new technologies. So again, just as I talked earlier in the steel sector, where we are looking about green steel, we are also trying to work on how do we put together offers from the aviation industry who say, if your service firm are willing to pay X extra for this flight, that is going to go into the development of this green kerosene. Or indeed, you say, we will take everybody who buys such a ticket, we will work out what a percentage of our revenue that is, and we will make sure that that percent of our fuel is this green kerosene. Now, I wouldn't rely solely on that. The other big thing here is to have what's called fuel duty mandates, which is just for the governments to say, sorry guys, this is not voluntary. By 2030, 15% of your fuel burn has to be green. By 2040, 70% by 2050. But there is a role for responsible service companies in helping to drive that process forward.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Robert. maybe if we can turn to the question we have from Joanna Place. I don't know if Joanna's able to.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord Turner. Thank you very much. So clearly, I had a question about this, and it's really how can boards supply chain by data should we be asking for? How should we do that we can have more controls?
Thanks, Joanna. Your line was a little bit crackly, so I'll maybe sort of paraphrase a little bit.
I think I got it, yeah.
You got it, okay, brilliant. Hopefully everyone else did as well.
So just to paraphrase that question was about supply chain emissions. How do you look up your supply chain and what are the levers that you can have? And I have to say, this is not an area of expertise, but there are many companies beginning to make those commitments. I mean, IKEA, for instance, has said it's going to look all the way up its supply chain and get to zero carbon. And retailers have huge power to be effective here. Step one is to measure it and to demand of your suppliers that whoever you are, that you want to know what their carbon emissions are, and that to be available on your list of suppliers, you will only do that if they will give you a clear and certifiable account of what their emissions are and why their emissions are that. And then once you've got that, there's really two categories of things. There's one, if there are easy ways to decarbonize, it's simply saying, guys, we are only going to buy from the guys who've done the easy decarbonization. We're not going to buy from the Neanderthals. We're going to buy from the guys who are ahead of the pack. Where it is literally more expensive to decarbonize, and we mentioned that earlier with the cement and concrete thing, if you're a property developer, you've got to decide whether you are willing to pay a premium price. It will tend to be a very small premium price as part of your end product price in order to enable that company to go down a decarbonization route. So it becomes, specific to each case. But I think, step one is to measure it. Step two is to understand whether your suppliers could fairly easily and cheaply and at no extra cost decarbonize it, in which case you just make it clear that that is a condition of doing business. Where it will be more expensive, you have to engage with them about whether you're willing to pay a premium price. Or there's an intermediate of saying, you will have to be zero carbon, we won't deal with you beyond a certain date. And then you also get ones where you have to engage in a relationship and a dialogue to actually both do something different. I think one of the most important areas where this will occur is everything to do with plastics. So plastics is a crucially important part of the story, significant part of total emissions from the whole chemical complex. And it's one where, although there are sort of technological ways to change the production of plastics and to apply carbon capture and storage, one of the big things we have to do is just recycle more plastics. And recycling plastics depends partly on how you design plastics to start with, how you actually design the packaging. Have you designed the packaging in a way where it is easy to separate two different categories of plastics and to put back them through the different recycling streams? Or have you created a package which, because you liked it, it had a particular design that you wanted, is difficult to recycle? This gets to real detail things like, the way that ink is applied within plastics, whether it is going to be easy to take off a label and recycle the plastics, or whether the inks are going to contaminate the plastics process. But the reason why I mention that is this is absolutely an area where you need cooperation across the supply chain between, for instance, the processed food suppliers and the retailers to think through and to specify and work out what the plastics packaging should be in order to make it recyclable at the end. So it varies sector by sector, but step one is to measure it.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you, Joanna, for that question. I think it does sort of underscore the importance of this understanding your value chain and understanding what kind of levers are going to work best in order to push the agenda. If I can just ask Joan McNulton, I think you had a question for Adair.
Thanks very much, Emily, and thank you, Adair. I mean, it's just so exciting to be a board member, as illustrated by your talk, given how many of these things we actually could get to grips with and the contribution we could make. But my question is, how would you advise boards on trying to manage the trade-offs between quick wins, short-term targets and reaching them, compared to really keeping your eye on the prize of net zero? Because there are some things you could do now, but that would help with some reduction, but might lock in emissions compared to where you could be in 2050. And as a kind of corollary to that, are offsets going to be a different part of making that journey and managing those trade-offs in a way that doesn't cause criticism? You know, if you're just focusing on 2050, that you're kicking the can down the road.
Excellent question, Joan. Nice to see you. There's one slide that I had prepared that I'd like to put up now. I think somebody's going to put it up, hopefully, which talks to this story. And it talks to what I called earlier, to the offset story, but I'll answer your other questions as well, Joan. And it's what I call the difference between the concave and the convex curve that I mentioned earlier. Just to get you into the acronyms on this chart, there's a thing called EBIT, that's energy, business, industry, and transport. And there's AFOLU, that is agriculture, food, and land use. If you take CO2 emissions, there's also, by the way, a very important issue to do with methane emissions, but I won't deal with that now. From the EBIT and AFOLU sectors, they're about 36 gigatons today. And you can see on the top line of the green and blue areas, our belief of how fast we could get those emissions down and how low we could get them. And we get them down by 2050 to only a couple of gigatons. And so we would say all companies should be planning to get pretty close to absolute net zero within themselves by 2050. And by 2050, we will not need offsets. So your plan as a company should not be, I'm going to be buying a whole load of offsets in 2050. However, that convex curve line that you can see there compares with what I call the concave line, which is the dashed line of what the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, says that we have got to do with emissions in order to be compatible with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And as you can see, that is much lower. And there is a gap between them, a sort of, oval-shaped gap. And the size of that gap you can see on the right-hand side. The cumulative green area emissions are 630. The cumulative AFOLU emissions are 60. That's 690. The remaining carbon budget of all the emissions we can put up into the atmosphere and still stay within 1.5, which is the area under the dashed line, is 500. The area between the lines is 190 or so. So the crucial issue is, how do we get the convex line down to the concave line, the top line down to the dashed line? Our key priority should be actually to find ways of reducing the gross emissions as fast as possible. And that's why we want as many people as possible to be buying electric vehicles as fast as possible, getting rid of coal as fast as possible, reducing methane emissions as fast as possible. But even once we've done that, we will probably have a difference. And there is opportunity to offset that in a number of ways, by reforestation, by bioenergy developments maybe, and at a later stage by direct air capture and carbon capture and storage. So there is a role for responsible companies to say, I have a clear plan to get to zero by 2050. I've really shaken the trees and worked at it, and this is as fast as I possibly can go. But having worked that out, in addition, I'm going to buy offsets, but they have to be in addition to, not instead of, the fastest possible decarbonisation plan that you can have. Now, the challenge then is, are there good offsets? The answer is a lot of people are working on this. I think the truth is that a lot of the offsets in the past have not been very good. And by the way, one giveaway is a price. If somebody offers you an offset at $2 or $3 a ton, it's probably not good enough, right? You're going to have to pay something for this. Be suspicious if somebody's issuing you a very cheap offset. But a lot of people are now working on gold standards, which really try to define what is possible here. So simple answer, Joan, yes, I think there is a role for offsets, but it must be as well as, in addition to, not instead of, very rapid decarbonisation within. The second question you mentioned, of course, was this issue of transitions. And these are tricky issues. Let's take the shipping industry. If you took a ship and you switched it from heavy fuel oil and you retrofitted it to burn natural gas, LNG, you would reduce the emissions, but you'd never get them to zero. You'll only get them to zero if you plan to probably move to ammonia made from hydrogen, made from green electrolysis. So you're absolutely right. There are a number of things where you get these transitions. And I think that the best guidance is be very wary of transitions which are also cul-de-sacs. Partial solutions where once you've done the partial solution, it isn't an intermediate stepping point to the full solution. It's something where you have to throw that away and start again. If there are ways where you can do a partial solution and that investment also helps you towards the end point, then that's good. But on the whole, we're pretty wary of things like LNG and shipping. Again, because if you do it, it'll be uneconomic to do anything than run that ship for the next 30 years. It just becomes very difficult to do it and then say, well, I'll do it for 15 years and then I'll go to ammonia.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Adair. Thank you very much, Joan. Really appreciate the question. And just one quick clarification point that's kind of come up in the Q&A. When you look at those numbers that you just showed on the slide, where does the energy efficiency gains come in? Is that taking into account some of those energy efficiency improvements that we might see as well?
Yes, it's trying to. That's really our first shot at that slide. We're working on it and we're highly likely to produce one that comes further down, which will have more energy efficiency in it. Crucial thing to realize, however, that the biggest single driver of energy efficiency is going to be electrification. And what I mean by that is, when you have an internal combustion engine, however carefully you drive it, only about 25% of the chemical energy in the petrol in it will end up as kinetic energy in the acceleration of your car. 75% will turn into heat. That's why when you put your hand on the bonnet of a car with an internal combustion engine, it's hot. When you go to an electric engine, 90% or even more of the energy in the battery will go into kinetic energy and only 10% will get wasted. Similarly, when you move from a gas boiler, you'll never get a gas boiler more than 90% efficient, even if you're maintaining it as well as ever. But with a heat pump, it seems like magic, but it isn't. you can put in a kilowatt hour of electricity and get 3 kilowatt hours of heat within your house because you've sucked 2 kilowatt hours of heat out of the ambient air. Electrification in and of itself is a major driver of energy efficiency. Having said that, we also have to have very strong focus on energy efficiency, which is why when you do go down a heat pump route, you should also be insulating your houses as rapidly as possible, as much as possible. It is why when we buy electric vehicles, we haven't got used to this, we should be asking how many watt hours does it require per kilometer traveled, right? And the more efficient it is, the lower it will be. And different ways that you design electric engines can take us more down that efficiency route. So yes, it is a very important part of the story. Obviously, we've taken some of the easy hanging fruit there. Most of our offices now have LED lighting. That was a huge improvement in efficiency. And we've now got to extend that to things like how we heat our buildings, the nature of transport, et cetera, including things which require improvements in energy productivity. And these are more complicated ones because they actually require an overall systems change. If we all decided that we didn't all need to own an individual car, but used more shared card services, we would save a hell of a lot of steel in the system. Because remember, the car in the street is one of the most underutilized capital assets you can imagine. It basically spends 95% of the time sitting around doing nothing and 2.5% of the time going round and round in circles looking for a parking space. Only about 2.5% of all car time is actually spent doing what it's meant to do, which is taking you from A to B. So this is actually quite a complicated thing to think about, but there are some big opportunities, not just on squeezing out technical energy efficiency, but moving whole systems onto a higher energy productivity basis. Some people think there are big opportunities there. Others think we'll just never be clever enough to make that transition, and we'll just replace our current inefficient transport system, but at least it will be electrified.
Thank you so much, Adair, and just thank you for all of the information that you've shared. I think it's given our boards lots to think about in terms of understanding their value chains, understanding where their emissions are, and this balancing act between what needs to happen immediately, but keeping an eye on what needs to happen in the longer term to get us to net zero. So really appreciate your time today. Thank you all of those that have joined us today, and please do reach out with further information. We'll make sure you get the reports that were mentioned and get back to you with some of the questions that we haven't been able to get to today. So really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much from everybody here at Chapter Zero.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.